Recording, and let's pick up with the American-Mexican conflict. Actually, we're not to the Mexican-American War yet. We're still, I think we ended with talking about briefly, just looking at this map of the Texas annexation. So we're going to talk about the events leading up to Texas becoming a republic first in 1836, and then they were not annexed by the United States until 1845. Well, so, okay, we talked about manifest destiny. And so that was kind of the spirit that was driving Americans. And when President Tyler came into office, he had one primary goal, or his biggest goal was to make Texas a United States state. So leading up to all this, before 1830, a man by the name of Stephen Austin had planted an American settlement, and it was a buffer, basically, between the Comanche Indians and Mexican settlements to the south. So somewhere in here. By 1830, there was 20,000 Americans living in this territory that will be considered Texas today, but was under the control of Mexico. Mexico had won their independence from Spain already. So Mexico was now a separate country, such as the United States. So Americans had formed a settlement there, and there was increasing talk and rumblings about that American colony gaining their independence from Mexico. In 1836, you had a battle at an old Catholic mission in San Antonio called the Alamo. The well-known general of Mexico, Santa Anna, surrounded the Alamo, this little mission, and I believe it was wanting to say 700 Americans, but maybe that's too many. 300, a very small contingent of Americans. Maybe it was 300 Americans and it was 7,000 Mexicans. But I mean, it was a great disadvantage. But they were able to fight off the larger Mexican army for 13 days. Everyone died except 2 Texans. And Santa Anna really was displayed some cruel tactics, and this really stirred Texans, Americans living there, to continue to resist Mexico. So February 23rd to March 6th. In a battle 1 month later, remember the Alamo is a rallying cry for the Army. And that other battle is the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. And this was an American victory, or this was a Texas victory, because Santa Anna was overconfident, and they chose a campsite that left them somewhat vulnerable, and the Texan forces surprised them while they were sleeping, and as they swarmed that camp, they would shout, "Remember the Alamo." And they were able to defeat Santa Anna, and he signed a pact or a treaty which gave Texas its independence in 1836. And a man by the name of Sam Houston was leading the Texas troops at that time. So you can hear the names of, the Texas capital, and then one of the largest cities in the United States, Austin and Houston, and the names of those men who were so critical in the early stages of Texas. So Texas was there we go, there's Sam Houston. And he's the first president of the Republic of Texas. If any of you guys still have a prom, some of you guys should get like a cane and hat like that. That would be impressive. Bow tie. So the Republic of Texas, you can see the area here, and this is the same area that we saw up here. The Panhandle, over half of New Mexico, little bitty southwest corner of Kansas, this L-shaped part of Colorado, and then the little south central section of Wyoming. That was the Republic of Texas from 1836 to 1845. And in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, and it became an official state of our republic. Now, the people of Mexico, the Mexican government never really accepted, even though Santa Anna signed the treaty, they never really accepted that Texas was independent. And then when Texas was annexed, they really didn't recognize that either. And so I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Make sure you can see this. So this here is the Rio Grande. And even though Texas as a republic said this was their border, Mexico really contended with that. Mexico said this river up here, I think the Nueces River, that was where the boundary was. And so in 1846, with the spirit of manifest destiny still very strong in the United States, and then Mexico still strongly resentful to the Texans' push for independence and then the annexation, and then the border battle of the south border of Texas. These are all factors that led to the Mexican-American War that was from 1846 to 1848. And I believe one of the key things about this war is it was the first war that was followed very closely by the press of the time. So that was kind of unique. You'll want to know that for the test. Because nowadays, you know, we're so used to seeing reporters right there in the war zones. And so this was the war in which press coverage was very, very influential. So there's the causes of the Mexican War. And that war ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Make that a little smaller. And these were the provisions of this treaty. The U.S. gained all of Texas to the Rio Grande. Mexico also ceded this Southwest territory, which includes, at the time called the New Mexico Territory, the Utah Territory, and California. And you would have other states carved out: Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. And 5 years later, the U.S. purchased this territory on the border, which would be Arizona and New Mexico's southern portion. The Gadsden Purchase to build a Southern Railroad. So we gained quite a bit of land as a result of our victory over Mexico. All right, any questions before we... Let me just quickly discuss, and I'm going through these quickly so we can get back on schedule for the last two meetings next week. The Oregon Country was, at this time, still jointly held by the U.S. and Great Britain. Although this was a long distance for Great Britain to be of concern, they really weren't that concerned about it. When President Tyler was still serving, his Secretary of State, Buchanan, put together a treaty called the Buchanan-Pakenham Treaty. And what it did was it extended the 49th parallel all the way west to the Pacific. And then we received all of the Oregon Territory, the United States. And then, of course, north of the 49th parallel was Great Britain. So that would give us the rest of Montana over here, and then Washington State. Seattle's up here. This is the Puget Sound area. Seattle, and then British Vancouver up here, British Columbia. Make sure you are familiar with, and this is on page 433, a map, but know about some of the trails, the westward trails, like the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail. Know about those trails that were the roadways for settlers to come west. So now we've gained all this territory. We still have, remember, this Oklahoma, which would be behind here, is Indian territory. And then you have the northern portion remaining of the Louisiana Purchase territory. There was some more states carved out. Remember, Missouri became a slave state in 1822, and they did that because Maine became a free state. But don't forget about the Missouri Compromise that said no states west of Missouri and north of Indian Territory. There would be no states that would be slave states. That's important for what we're going to continue to move on here in a moment about. Do you have any questions about the acquisition of this Texas and the Southwest as a result of our conflict with Mexico? Now, there was a couple of things I wanted you to know about a couple presidents. On page 442, you'll need to know about, and it tells you about President William Henry Harrison. He became the oldest president in 1841 at the time, but that's not what you need to know. What he is known for is having the shortest presidency ever. He only served 1 month, and he died of pneumonia. So William Henry Harrison, the president with the shortest tenure. So his vice president, John Tyler, became the president, and he was the one who wanted Texas to become a state. And so there's 4 objectives that President Polk had. He followed Tyler. The last thing that Tyler did as president was he was able to sign the resolution that admitted Texas as the 28th state. So he was able to see Texas come in under his presidency. But then President Polk began serving after Tyler, and I want you to be aware of his 4 objectives on page 445. To reduce tariffs on imports, to reestablish the independent treasury He did not want any national banks, to settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, and then to acquire California from Mexico. I guess I should clarify that the California was not a part of this Mexican cession territory from the Treaty of 1848. It came in 2 years later. So know those things about those presidents. So one of the big issues we should say the biggest issue with the continued westward expansion of the United States territory is, as more and more land is being added, the balance between slave states and free states continues to come to the surface. And so I mentioned Texas being the 28th state, but it was actually the 15th slave state. So that means 15 states are slave states and 13 are free states. So the balance is off there. And so more territory has been added, and you have territory below the 3630 parallel, which is the northern boundary of Oklahoma. Anything below that could be added as a slave state. Everything above that would be free. You can see there is more territory that could be carved up into states in the north. And so this is a big consequence of westward expansion, making sure there's a balance between slave and free states. Keeping in mind that many in the northern states were now pushing for complete abolition of slavery. So there were several factors in this tension between the North and South. Also, the North wanted to still put into place the American plan of Clay, internal improvements, more railroads, more modes of transportation that would help with the westward expansion. So there's a different outlook between the South and the North. And so these things are all still right there underneath the surface boiling as we continue to acquire land. So in 1846, a senator, a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot proposed that Texas be annexed as a slave state, which they were, and then slavery be prohibited in the remaining territory gained from Mexico. So things were festering below the surface already, and this really ignited the debate over the westward expansion and slavery. So in 1846, they took a vote in Congress on the Wilmot Proviso. The House of Representatives approved it. The Senate rejected it. President Polk basically dismissed it. He didn't veto. He just basically said it was kind of fanciful thinking and just really dismissed it and ignored it. Around that time, another senator from Michigan named Lewis Cass put the idea out there of what's called popular sovereignty. And what this idea did was, whenever a new state was carved out in the Western territories, whatever, if a new state is created, then the citizens of that territory will regulate their own internal affairs in their own way. And if they want to have slavery, that will be their decision. If they prohibit slavery, very well. Congress would not have a hand in it. So popular sovereignty. This did not catch on either. Now you think maybe that the South would like it because they were for states' rights, but they just didn't want to leave it open to, they didn't want to leave open the possibility that more states will continue to enter that are anti-slavery, and it just kind of snowballed. And then around this time, you had a coalition start made up of Northern Democrats that were opposed to slavery, anti-slavery Northern Whigs, as well as members of the Abolitionist Liberty Party, who pushed for a complete expansion, the complete prevention of expansion of slavery into the new Western territories. They became known as Free Soilers, and then in 1848, a party was formed called the Free Soil Party. That was their main issue. They also had other issues on their platform, such as internal improvements. And this group also foreshadows the new Republican Party that will start in 1854. So they put forth Zachary Taylor as their first candidate for president, one of the generals of the Mexican-American War, one of the celebrated generals. And he does not win one state in the electoral votes, but he did have 300,000 popular votes. He finished third. But it's demonstrating an increase in sharp divides of sectionalism. Any questions before we take a break? So be familiar with the Wilmot Proviso. And just as we looked at the stepping stones that led to the Revolutionary War, like the Proclamation of 1763, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, those types of things, we're going to look at the stepping stones to the Civil War. So remember, probably we'll start back with the compromise, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So know the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. I have 10:15, so we'll come back at 10:20, and we'll pick up with the Compromise of 1850. All right. Let's see, 10:20. So let's continue on. All right, is that back up, the Free Soil Party? Everybody see the slides again? All right. So before we jump into the Compromise of 1850, in 1849, they struck gold in California, and this led to the largest mass migration in the United States history. Thousands of mostly young men coming to California to hopefully find gold. California became a key state in the slavery debate. President Taylor wanted to make California and New Mexico, and that would at this time be all of this, before it was New Mexico and Arizona. He wanted to make them both free states, and he just wanted to do it very quickly, not even bring it up for debate or discussion in the Senate. Just completely bypassed the slavery issue. Just quickly bring them into the Union as slave states and just bypass it completely. In 1849, California set up their own government, and it was a non-slavery government. New Mexico followed suit in 1850, and so they had set up, territorial governments that were anti-slave. And so in 1850, Congress took up President Taylor's suggestion, but Congress would not accept it. Now you want to turn, if you have your textbooks, to 457. I'm sorry, 459. The Compromise of 1850 is one of the one of our Congress's most, maybe we should say, intense political discussions and negotiations. Lasted for 7 months. Henry Clay, who we've seen in the past and was known as the Great Compromiser, came up with, and they're on page 457, that's why I accidentally said it first, came up with 7 resolutions. And that was early in the negotiations. But after all those months of negotiations, they kind of tweaked it, and they came up with those 5 that are on page 459. And this is the final version, known as the Compromise of 1850, which I think 4 of them are up here on my slide. California would come in as a free state. The Texas-New Mexico Act, which was a provision of this compromise, made New Mexico a separate territory along with Utah that were open to slavery. You can see that we gave or Texas was paid $10 million for giving up their claims to New Mexico, which would have been remember, over half of New Mexico was a part of the Texas territory. So the United States government paid them $10 million to do that. Another provision of this compromise was that the slave trade in the District of Columbia, the D.C. area, the slave trade would be banned, the U.S. participating in it. Or they had already been banned, but internal trading had continued. That was abolished, although slavery was still allowed in the District of Columbia. There was no more slave trade. And then the key thing that really, you can know all of these things, but the one that I want you to really be familiar with, probably for test purposes, is a strong fugitive slave law was a part of the Compromise of 1850. And there were severe penalties if anyone was caught assisting a runaway slave. And bounty hunters even abused this Slave Act, because free slaves in the North would be kidnapped and taken back to the South, and it would be claimed that they were runaway slaves. So it was a very controversial part of the Compromise of 1850. I would also like you to know for the test about a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became a bestseller, written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it's an example of it's an example that shows the power of the pen, because this book was it would be a bestseller today. 300,000 copies in America, 1 million in Great Britain. And it touched on so many themes about the evils of slavery. And it was just highly influential in our culture at the time, and for the movement to completely abolish slavery. The Southern slaveholders hated it. And this was interesting, I thought. It's on page 461 of your textbook, that one of the angry Southern slaveholders even sent her a severed ear of one of the disobedient slaves. So anger and tensions are really flaring up. This is a good comparison for U.S. citizens to look at today, because of how sharply divided our country is and the increasing anger and violence that we're seeing between the two factions. The two big factions in America today of the what we might call the left-wing liberals and the right-wing conservatives. But anyway, so this remained controversial, and in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was proposed by an Illinois senator named Stephen Douglas. And if any of you are in speech and debate and you are a part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, this is that Stephen Douglas who debated Abraham Lincoln. But he promoted the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Being from Illinois, there was talk at the time of completing a railroad that would be a transcontinental railroad from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And one of the main reasons was to improve and also increase our trade with Asia. Now, another reason was that it would help get more settlers out to the west, but, increasing the trade with Asia, it was a key thing. So Senator Douglas, like most senators who do things to benefit their state, he wanted Chicago to be the hub of this transcontinental railroad. similar to if you've ever flown, I think Delta Airlines. Could be mistaken on that, but if you fly Delta, you are most likely, if you go east, you're going to probably have to go through Atlanta because Atlanta is a big hub for Delta. So he wanted Chicago to be the hub kind of in the central United States for this transcontinental railroad. In order to get support from Southerners, Douglas advocated that all new territories would be formed and have the right of popular sovereignty. The reason this is so controversial is because all this territory up here to the north of the 3630 line is supposed to be free. So, for example, Montana, when they start to form, they have to be a free state according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. But what the Kansas-Nebraska Act would do would basically find a way around it and eventually overturn the Missouri Compromise. So in 1854, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory, still very large here, they came in as territories. They were above the 3630 line, or 3630. And now they were going to have popular sovereignty. This act passed, and it inflamed the tensions once again between the North and the South. This is when a new political party sprouted up in 1854. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, Northern Democrats left the party because they were dividing. The Democratic Party was dividing among sectional lines. The Whig Party essentially ceased to exist because of differing views over slavery. And so anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats joined with that Free Soiler Party that formed 6 years before, and they formed the modern-day Republican Party that we have today still. And the Democratic Party was at that time mostly concentrated in the South. So the two parties that we know of today have been together since 1854. You'll want to know that fact. The main political platform for the Republican Party, and I believe this is the first party to have this outright in the open, to exclude slavery completely from the Western territories. And also in this party, you had a young Republican, or you had a young man who became a Republican. He was a Whig, but he left because he was so angry about what had been going on that he became a Republican. He was a young Republican from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. All right, we're going to end today talking about Bleeding Kansas. So Kansas and Nebraska territories are now a part of the United States. They still have to go through the steps to statehood, but they are territories, and they are under popular sovereignty. In 1855, a pro-slavery legislature was formed. In 1856, an anti-slavery legislature was formed. So you had kind of, in microcosm, a civil war in Kansas 4 years before the actual Civil War of the Union. You had these two groups form governments. In 1856, on May 21st, you had the sack of Lawrence, Kansas. These were pro-slavery forces who went into Lawrence, did a lot of damage, stirred up tensions. One of those that was stirred was a man by the name of John Brown, who came with his sons from Massachusetts and went into Pottawatomie, Kansas, on the Pottawatomie Creek, and retaliated for the sack of Lawrence and killed several people. May 24th and 25th is known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Three months later, on August 30th, again, you had pro-slavery forces attack or ambush another Kansas village called Osawatomie. And you had this kind of guerrilla warfare break out. So the name that it became known as was Bleeding Kansas. By the end of 1856, around 200 Kansans had been killed. So while this was happening on the Kansas frontier, back in D.C. in the Congress, a feud broke out. Now this says Bleeding Congress, but it's more well known as Bleeding Sumner, Sumner. What happened was, one day after the sack of Lawrence, so May 22nd, 1856, Charles Sumner, who was a Massachusetts senator, gave a very fiery speech in the Senate chambers on the crime against Kansas. And he just was venting. He condemned the pro-slavery settlers, saying that they were, quote, the hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization, end quote. He even insulted an aged pro-slavery senator from South Carolina named A.P. Butler, made fun of him, and had many other insults in his speech. Well, Mr. Butler had a relative named Preston Brooks, a younger senator from South Carolina there. And when he heard Charles Sumner give his speech, this angered him greatly. He walked over to Sumner with his gold-handled cane and proceeded to cane him, that is, to beat him at least 30 times with the cane, and it was literally bleeding Sumner. Sumner almost died, and I believe his injuries were so extensive that his Senate seat was vacant for over 2 years. And while Brooks was doing this to Sumner, all of the people in the chamber were just watching there stunned, mostly the Northerners. The Southerners started cheering him on. Here is a famous depiction of that. No doubt from a Southern viewpoint, Southern chivalry. Actually, I bet that's a Northern guy because argument versus clubs, right? Ideas and arguments versus violence. So you'll want to know the formation. You'll want to know in the steps leading up to the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And I think I need to say before that the Compromise of 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act being critical. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the new party of the Republicans in 1854, and then Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner in 1856. So we'll pick up there the last part of chapter 13 on the election of 1856 and the election of 1860. And then we'll begin chapter 14 on the Civil War and finish it next Thursday. So any questions before we dismiss? Have a great weekend. We will see you on Tuesday.